The wind off the ridge was sharp that morning. It cut through wool and skin and bone alike, the kind of cold that cracked wagon wheels and made horses refuse to move. Gideon Price, stage driver out of New Hope, had made this run 100 times, but never in frost like this. His boots broke the frozen crust of snow as he unhitched his mare for a quick rest behind Weir Hollow Cemetery, a place folks didn't stop unless they had a reason. Gideon didn't, except that his bladder gave him no choice. He trudged into the trees just beyond the stone wall, hoping for a bit of cover. That's when he saw it. At first he thought it was a sack, maybe turnips dumped by a poor soul too weak to carry them. But then he caught the shape of it. Small, human, his breath caught. The boy lay on his side, barely half covered by snow, like someone had tried to hide him in a hurry and didn't finish the job. His skin was tinged gray-blue, lips cracked open in a frozen gasp. Eyes shut, arms crossed like someone had folded them there on purpose. His fingers were purple and stiff, one still curled as though reaching for something that wasn't there. Gideon didn't move for a long time. He'd seen death before: drownings, farm accidents, bodies chewed on by winter wolves. But this had a stillness to it that didn't feel natural. No frost on the lashes, no scavenger marks, no signs of a struggle. Just a boy lying neat as a parlor doll in a shallow dip behind the old cemetery wall, where the ground was softest after rain. He knelt down, slow, and touched 2 fingers to the boy's neck, not to check for a pulse, but more like a gesture, some kind of silent apology for finding him like this. The boy couldn't have been older than 9, brown hair, good boots, but no coat, just a linen shirt and breeches, stiff with ice. His face didn't carry pain, only quiet. Behind him, the mare whinnied low. A branch snapped. Wind or something else, he couldn't say. Gideon stood and looked toward the graveyard. Dozens of headstones leaned like drunks in the frost. But none fresh, and no tracks in or out but his own. He was sure of one thing: someone had put the boy there deliberately, carefully, but not lovingly, like a secret buried too shallow. And whoever it was hadn't expected the frost to come early. When the news reached the center of Weir Hollow, the townsfolk didn't scream or gasp. They didn't flood into the church, or form search parties, or crowd around the cemetery fence. They simply paused. A slow, silent stillness that passed through the town like a long shadow. Mrs. Alder, who sold eggs from her porch, turned her sign to "Gone" without saying a word. The blacksmith hammered one last blow, then left his iron to cool, and old Reverend Callum, who hadn't left the chapel steps in years, closed the doors and bolted them from the inside. This was not a town that liked noise, or visitors, or questions. It had existed for close to 100 years, tucked between the hills and the hollows, and in all that time its people had come to one quiet understanding. What happens in Weir Hollow stays in Weir Hollow, or it gets buried. But someone did step forward. A man in a soot-stained coat and boots that didn't match. Jonathan Creeley. He walked with a slow limp, like the cold had crept into his bones and made itself at home. Beside him, his wife Ruth kept her hands clenched in her apron. She didn't cry. She didn't look up. They came to the sheriff's porch and said only one thing: "That's our boy, Isaac Creeley, 8 years old. Last seen 6 days prior, before the storm. Had gone out to feed the chickens and never came back. They hadn't told anyone." No posters, no church bells, no riders sent to the next town over. Jonathan had lit a lamp and searched the fields. Ruth had sat by the window each night, waiting for the gate to creak open. But when it didn't, they stopped waiting. The sheriff didn't scold them for the silence. He didn't ask why they hadn't spoken up sooner. He only nodded, slowly, and reached for a tin of tobacco with hands that trembled more than usual. "I'll arrange for the undertaker," he said. Jonathan looked past him, toward the hills. "No need. We'll handle it ourselves." The sheriff opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, because this was Weir Hollow, and the rule of thumb, the only rule, really was, if a family wants to bury its own, you let them. No matter the circumstances. That night, a pine coffin was seen being pulled up the hill by lantern light. No one followed, no one offered help, no hymns were sung, and no bell tolled from the chapel. And when dawn came, the snow was undisturbed, as if the boy had never died at all. They buried Isaac the next morning, before the frost could melt from the tall grass. The sun had barely broken the tree line when the Creelys laid the pine casket into the ground, just behind the family plot near the edge of their property, where the trees thinned and the soil stayed soft. There was no procession, no neighbors in black, no mourning bells from the chapel, no priest with trembling hands and a holy book. Just the Creelys, Jonathan, Ruth, and their two older boys, Eli and Thomas, standing over the grave with pale faces and stiff postures, as if movement might cause something to shatter. Jonathan did most of the digging himself. He'd been at it before the sun came up, driving the shovel into the earth in steady, angry thrusts, like he was punishing the land for taking something it had no right to. Ruth watched from the porch for a time, arms wrapped so tightly across her chest it looked like she was holding herself together by force. She only moved when it was time to lower the box into the hole. The casket was small. Isaac had been small. The kind of boy who still struggled to tie his boots without falling over, who sang nonsense songs under his breath when he thought no one could hear. Ruth had built the box herself the night before, sawing and sanding until her hands were blistered. She'd lined it with his quilt, the blue one with stitched stars she'd made when he was born. They said no words, not because they didn't have them, but because speaking them out loud would make it real. Eli, the oldest, reached for a handful of soil and scattered it across the lid. He did it the way you toss feed to chickens without thought, just motion. Thomas wouldn't come near the edge. He stared at the trees instead, jaw clenched, like he could make the world disappear if he refused to look at it. Jonathan wiped his brow with a handkerchief and filled the grave back in, one scoop at a time, until the mound stood clean and high and solemn in the wind. When he was done, he pressed the shovel into the ground like a marker. No cross, no name, no date. They stood a few minutes more, just enough to be respectful, then turned and walked back toward the house without a word. The back door shut. The chickens stirred. A pot boiled over. And behind them, the wind picked up across the fresh earth, whistling low between the pines. It almost sounded like a voice. Almost. The first to mention it was old Mr. Bellamy, who lived a quarter-mile east through the woods. He'd knocked on the Creelys' door with his hat in his hands and a strange look behind his eyes, half sympathy, half something else. He said he wasn't trying to be rude, but the sound had carried. Not from the barn. Not from the coop. From inside the house. "Thought it was a cat at first," he said. "Then I realized it sounded like it knew how to suffer." Jonathan didn't invite him in, just stared from the doorway and said, "We've had no such noise." But Bellamy wasn't the last. 2 nights later, Ruth was boiling water when a tap came at the kitchen window. She opened the door, expecting a fox to be sniffing around the steps again. Instead, it was Elsie Thatcher, cheeks red from the cold, arms folded tight. She looked over Ruth's shoulder, like expecting to see someone behind her. "I hate to ask, Ruth," she said softly, "but is Thomas ill?" Ruth blinked. "No." "Then I don't know what I heard," Elsie whispered. "It sounded like choking, like a child underwater." That night, Ruth sat up in bed long after Jonathan fell asleep. She heard nothing but the usual creaks of timber settling, the occasional whine of wind beneath the floorboards. But when the fire began to die and the shadows grew long, she swore she heard breathing. Not from the bed beside her, not from upstairs, from beneath the floor. It was ragged and wet, like lungs that weren't used to air. By the end of the week, the neighbors had stopped coming, not because they weren't concerned, but because they were afraid of what they might hear next. The crying came after midnight now. It threaded through the wind like a thread pulled tight, rising and falling, never quite childlike, never quite human. Inside the Creeley house, no one spoke of it. The boys kept to their rooms. Jonathan drank more than he used to. Ruth cleaned constantly, as though scrubbing the walls would chase it out. On the sixth night, she stood alone by the hearth after the others had gone to sleep. The fire had dimmed to embers. Her hands were raw from soap and scouring. And when the crying began again soft, broken, and too close, she didn't flinch. Instead, she whispered, "Isaac?" And from the darkness, she thought she heard the smallest reply. Just one word, choked, strangled, almost swallowed whole. "Mama." It was just past dusk when Thomas spotted him. He'd been sent out to fetch firewood from the pile near the barn, grumbling under his breath, reluctant to step into the wind that had turned sharper in the last hour. He was halfway back to the house, arms full of bark-slick logs, when something caught in his periphery a shape at the tree line. Not an animal, not a shadow. A boy. He stood still between the trees, half shrouded in brush, like the forest was trying to take him back in. His shirt hung loose and dark with damp. His hair clung to his temples. His hands were by his sides, palms facing out. And even though Thomas hadn't seen him move, the boy's eyes were locked onto him wide and sunken like they didn't belong to someone living. Thomas dropped the wood. He didn't scream, not yet. He backed toward the house, slipping once on the wet earth, not daring to turn his back. By the time he reached the porch and flung the door open, the boy had vanished. Ruth found him pale and breathless, one hand still on the doorknob, the other pointing out into the dark. She called for Jonathan. They went back outside with a lantern, scouring the edge of the woods. The snow was patchy and shallow, and in one patch, beneath the ashen branches of a dogwood, they saw it. Footprints. Small ones. Bare. Too small to belong to Thomas. Too recent to be Isaac's ghost. Jonathan said nothing, just stared down at the tracks and turned back toward the house, jaw tight, knuckles white where they gripped the lantern handle. But Ruth followed them deeper. The trail led between the trees for 20 yards and then stopped. Not turned, not faded stopped, as if the boy had simply ceased to exist mid-step. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, word had spread. Somebody had seen the figure too, someone passing through town at the wrong time, or maybe the right one. A drifter headed west, who stopped at the general store only long enough to say, "You've got something wrong living near them woods," before refusing to go back through Weir Hollow again. Jonathan didn't speak of it, not to his sons, not to Ruth. But the way he kept glancing at the tree line from the window, clutching the same bottle of rye for 3 days, told her everything she needed to know. It was Isaac. Every hair on Ruth's neck told her so. Not just in appearance, but in the way he stood, in the tilt of his shoulders. In the same way he'd looked at her the last time he was alive, with a mouth too afraid to speak, and eyes full of something he'd never had the chance to say. But what chilled her most wasn't that he'd returned. It was that he never once knocked on the door. The boy sat at the kitchen table, knees together, hands resting too neatly in his lap. Clara poured him a bowl of broth in and hot, with bits of onion and potato curling in the steam, and watched as he lifted the spoon with stiff, deliberate fingers. He ate without slurping, without dripping, without once looking down. He didn't thank her. He didn't say a word. Thomas wouldn't sit near him. He hovered in the doorway instead, face pale, eyes darting from the boy to his mother and back. Ruth stayed upstairs, saying her prayers loud enough for the whole house to hear. Jonathan hadn't come home since yesterday. Clara didn't ask where he'd gone. Because this was her son, her Isaac. His hands were the same, she said, small and cold. She remembered every scar, every freckle, every ridge of his thumbnail. She pressed her fingers to the mole on his left shoulder and whispered, "Just like when you were born." And when the boy didn't flinch, didn't even blink, she pulled him into her arms and called him her miracle. But the boy never hugged back. That first night, she tucked him into the cot by the fireplace and left a candle burning. He didn't close his eyes, just stared up at the ceiling with lips slightly parted, breathing slow and shallow. When Clara returned a few hours later, the wax had run down the holder, the flame guttered out, but the boy hadn't moved. Not once. He didn't speak. Not in the morning, when she dressed him in Isaac's old clothes. Not when Thomas tried to provoke him by shouting his name. Not when the neighbors came to the fence and whispered, asking questions that wouldn't say themselves aloud. Still, Clara insisted, she made porridge for him every morning. She braided his hair like she had when he was 5. She read from the Psalms and taught him his letters all over again, even when he wouldn't hold the pencil, even when he wouldn't meet her eyes. But he watched. God, how he watched! He sat in corners when no one called him there. He stood in doorways without announcing himself. More than once, Ruth found him behind her in the pantry without hearing his footsteps. His eyes followed everyone's low, steady, never blinking enough. Clara didn't seem to mind. But Thomas swore the boy's pupils were always too wide, like he was staring through everyone instead of at them. By the third night, Ruth locked her bedroom door. Thomas started sleeping with a knife beneath his pillow. And still, Clara smiled. She sat by the fire and brushed the boy's hair until the candlelight flickered low, whispering lullabies into the silence. No one in Weir Hollow had the courage to ask why her son came back with no voice, no scars from the cold, no memory of the grave they put him in. But everyone was thinking the same thing, whatever that thing was. It wasn't Isaac. At first, Clara thought it was just the shock. Children don't come back from the dead, not in Weir Hollow, not anywhere. She believed the silence, the strange habits, were the residue of whatever suffering he'd endured before they found him again. She told herself he needed time. But the others in the house saw what she refused to. Isaac or whatever, he never spoke to his siblings. When Thomas tried to tousle his hair the way brothers do, the boy flinched so violently that he knocked over the candle holder and hissed like a kettle. Ruth reached for his hand once during supper. He jerked back so fast, the spoon clattered to the floor, and he wouldn't touch his food for the rest of the meal. He didn't cry. He didn't laugh. He didn't blink unless he was being watched. Clara tried to bathe him once, filling a basin with warm water and scrubbing gently at his hands. They were streaked with soil-thick black dirt beneath every nail, crusted around the knuckles, packed into the cuticles like it had been there for weeks. But even after she washed him clean, the next morning his feet were muddy again. He'd slept all night by the hearth, the doors were bolted, the windows sealed. Still, there he stood by the stove, toes stained dark as peat, soles slick with muck. No one saw him walk in or out, yet somehow the dirt always came back. At night, they would hear the floorboards creak just once and find him standing at the same place in front of the sitting room wall. Every night, he never touched it. He never turned when they spoke. He simply stood there, unmoving, until Clara led him away or the lamp ran out of oil. One night, Thomas threw a Bible at him, hoping to snap him out of whatever spell he was under. The boy didn't flinch. The book hit the floor beside him with a loud thud, and still he didn't move. Just breathed. That shallow, slow kind of breath, like something imitating the rhythm of life, without really understanding it. By the fourth night, Ruth refused to come downstairs at all. She said she saw the boy licking soot off the chimney bricks when he thought no one was looking. Jonathan still hadn't come home. Clara kept brushing the boy's hair, humming songs from when he was young, wiping his feet clean each morning. "He's adjusting," she'd whisper. "He's here. He's home." But Thomas had already started locking his bedroom door. He no longer called him Isaac, and neither did Ruth. Because whatever he wasn't getting better. He was waiting. The morning of the 10th day broke cold and wet, a slush of rain falling over Weir Hollow like the sky itself had grown tired. Clara rose early, as she always did now, long before the sun had found its way through the fog, and set the kettle on the stove. The silence in the house was heavier than usual, thick with the scent of wood smoke and something faintly metallic beneath it. She lit a lamp and crept upstairs. Isaac hadn't stirred all night. No pacing, no scraping floorboards, no muddy footprints on the stairs. For the first time since his return, she'd slept through the night. She pushed open the door to his room, the hinges groaning low like a warning. There he was, lying perfectly still beneath the wool blanket, arms at his sides, face turned slightly toward the wall, just as she'd left him. But his eyes were open. Not the sleepy fluttering of a child just waking, no. They were glassy, wide, fixed, the same pale blue from the day the stagecoach driver had found him half frozen behind the cemetery. She called his name softly at first, then again louder. He didn't blink. She crossed the room and placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. His skin was cold, not the chill of a restless sleeper, but the kind that came after breath had left. Still, she shook him, then gripped both shoulders and screamed for Thomas, for Ruth, for anyone. The boy didn't move. By the time Thomas burst into the room, Clara had fallen to her knees beside the bed. Her hands were clutching at the blanket, her voice hoarse from sobbing. She kept saying the same thing over and over. He was fine. He was just fine. Thomas didn't answer. He was staring at the boy's eyes. They were still open, still fixed on the same patch of wall. No wounds, no blood, not a scratch on his body, just gone. The others gathered slowly. Ruth lingered at the doorway, refusing to step inside. One look at the still form in the bed, and she turned pale. "He wasn't asleep," she whispered, not looking at anyone. "He never slept. Not really." The doctor wasn't called. There was no doctor in Weir Hollow anymore, not since the last one had vanished with a horse and cart full of books a year before. And even if there had been, Clara wouldn't have allowed it. She sat there all day, rocking gently beside the bed, humming old lullabies, brushing the boy's cold hair with her fingers. When night came, she finally rose, walked to the linen chest, and began folding the shroud again. For the second time in 10 days, she buried her son. And this time, she made sure the casket was nailed shut. The morning after the second death, fog hung low over Weir Hollow, thicker than any in recent memory, the kind that seemed to muffle even the crows. Word spread quickly, as it always did in towns where people said little and listened much. They said Clara had lost her mind, that grief had bloated her heart and soured her reason. But no one dared say it to her face. Clara wanted a second burial. She insisted on it, a proper one this time, not in the family plot, not beneath the same tree where they'd laid him just 10 days prior, somewhere deeper. Somewhere the cold couldn't reach, and whatever followed them from that field couldn't find him again. She sent word to the church. The priest refused. "Whatever came back to you," he wrote in a note pinned to her gate, "was not the boy you buried." So it was Ethan who lifted the body, wrapped tightly in linen, small enough to hold against his chest like he had when Isaac was a newborn. The boy's weight didn't feel right. It was too light, too stiff. The kind of weight that didn't shift when carried like a bundle of dry branches. Ethan didn't speak a word as he passed the front gate. Clara followed behind, holding a lantern even though the sky had already begun to lighten. The fog wasn't moving. It clung to them like wet wool. No neighbors joined them this time. No one dared step out. They didn't walk to the cemetery. They turned east, past the fence line, into the thickets where the deer no longer ran, and even the children had stopped playing. It had rained the night before, and the ground pulled at their boots, sucked at their steps like it didn't want them to go farther. Ethan said nothing. Not when Clara slipped on the incline, not when the trees grew too tight to pass without ducking. They came to a clearing eventually, one without headstones, no markers, just earth and rot, and the quiet hum of something ancient sitting beneath the soil. Ethan dug with a rusted spade, one-handed, cradling the boy with the other. Each strike into the ground let out a wet, hollow sound like digging through ribs. When the hole was wide enough, he laid the boy down without a word. Clara tried to pray, but the words caught in her throat. Her voice cracked on the first line of the psalm, and she stopped. There was no priest, no blessing, no name spoken aloud. Ethan filled the grave himself, packed the dirt tight, then placed a single stone at the head, unmarked. They didn't speak on the walk home, but behind them, long after they were gone, the fog remained, sitting low over the disturbed earth, refusing to rise. The wind rattled the shutters long after nightfall, but Clara had stopped noticing. Weir Hollow always moaned and the dark trees creaked, fences shifted, and the woods whispered things best left unheard. But this night was different. The house felt swollen, too still, like it was holding its breath. Clara lay on her side, facing the window. Ethan slept beside her, mouth slightly open, chest rising slow and steady. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. She'd banked the stove before bed. Still, her hands were numb. Then it came. Soft at first. So soft she thought it might be the wind threading through the joists beneath the house. A thin, reedy whimpering like a wounded animal. But it grew louder, more human, less animal. It came in uneven bursts, not from outside, but beneath her under the floor itself. She sat up. The crying stopped. She held her breath, unsure if she'd imagined it. Then it started again, a low, gurgling sob that seemed to push up from the very bones of the house, like something wet and broken was curled inside the walls. Clara stood slowly, bare feet hitting the cold wood with a small knock. The sound was closer now. Beneath her, directly under the bed, not muffled like a dream, it was there, real. She stepped forward. The crying halted the moment her hand touched the wall. Nothing. Not a sound. She pressed her palm flat against the wood paneling, then leaned down and laid her ear to the floor. It was warm, damp, and then a whisper. It was faint, so faint she couldn't be sure it was real, but it sounded like a word, drawn out and breathless, not shouted, said, "Ma." Clara pulled back sharply. Her chest tightened. She blinked, stood upright, and forced herself to breathe slow. She looked to the door, thought about waking Ethan. But some deep, private instinct told her not to. Not yet. She moved to the hallway. It was darker there, the kind of dark that seemed thick with dust. She walked past the room where the children used to sleep, past the small sitting room no one used anymore, all the way to the end of the hallway, where the boards creaked, just before the floor dipped slightly. The crying started again. Underfoot. Short gasps now, rhythmic, like someone sobbing through clenched teeth. Clara dropped to her knees, pressing her hands hard to the planks. Her voice caught in her throat, but she forced it out. Isaac? Silence. Then 3 knocks. From beneath the floorboards. Even now, she cannot say why she did not scream, why she didn't wake Ethan, but in that moment she simply sat there in the hallway with her hands on the floor, waiting for the crying to start again. The first night Clara went out, she didn't bother with boots. The frost bit through her stockings before she even reached the edge of the yard. The moon hung low and wide over the trees, and the ground behind the house steamed faintly in its light, as if it, too, had been holding its breath. She carried no lantern, no shovel at first, just her hands, wrapped in old linen, and a will that had stopped listening to reason. Ethan found her the next morning, knees black with mud, fingers torn raw, a shallow hole clawed into the earth behind the shed. She didn't look up when he called her name. She just kept scraping. On the second night, she took a trowel. By the third, she brought the rusted garden spade from the barn. No one in town asked questions. No one came to see. By the 5th night, she dug a trench deep enough to bury a man. She did not cry. She did not speak to the children. She barely ate. When Ethan tried to stop her, she simply said, "That wasn't him," and turned back to the dirt. "They gave us something else. He's still down there." Sometimes, she muttered to herself. Other times, she'd freeze in place, tilt her head, and listen, as if waiting for something beneath her to move, to speak. And once, only once, Ethan swore. He heard her whisper a lullaby into the hole, a tune she used to hum when Isaac was sick. The townspeople watched from a distance, behind drawn curtains and lamplight. No one dared to approach. Weir Hollow had its own rules for grief, and they didn't include interference. Those who whispered called it madness. Others said it was proof that the Creeley boy had never come back right, that something had gone terribly wrong. By the 7th night, Clara hit something solid. She didn't scream, didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees and cleared the earth with her bare hands, brushing away decades of soil until the corner of a wooden box emerged. The same pine slats Ethan had hammered shut with nails he could barely hold through his shaking. The same box they'd buried a week after that awful morning when the boy had returned. But now, the lid was different. Slick with dampness, bent at one end. And when Clara laid her hand against it, she swore the wood was warm, warmer than the air, warmer than her own skin. She did not open it that night. She just sat there, in the half-dug grave behind her home, mud soaking through her dress, and whispered, "I'm coming. I know now. I know you're still down there." Ethan hadn't meant to find the journal. He'd gone to the attic to look for blankets, something heavier to wrap around Clara, when he dragged her back inside after another night in the dirt. She was breaking, knew it, but he didn't know how to stop it. He thought maybe warmth would help. Maybe if he could get her to sleep just one full night, things might right themselves. The attic was low-ceilinged, built when people were shorter and hope was thinner. Mice had made nests in the corners. Old trunks lined the back wall like coffins. He found the journal in one of them, tucked beneath a yellowing baptismal gown and a bundle of ribbon-tied letters no one had opened in decades. It was leather-bound, rough with age, and heavy in a way that made his hands sweat. Inside, the handwriting was neat, looped in the careful strokes of a woman who'd been taught that appearances mattered even in madness. December 4th, 1839. My girl is dead, or so I thought. The pages were filled with it, page after page of a woman unraveling, though she never used words like madness or grief. The entries spoke plainly, unflinchingly. A fever. A small grave dug beneath the willow at dusk. A silence in the house that held for 2 days. And then, she came back. Pale, quiet, the wrong smile. Ethan read on, throat tightening. She watched me sleep. This girl who wore my daughter's face. I knew something was wrong when she took my hand but held it too still. Her skin was like paper over frost, but I told myself I was tired. That sorrow plays cruel games. The entry dated a week later was shorter. I found her in the root cellar, staring at the wall. She didn't blink. When I touched her shoulder, she said something I will never forget. "You buried the wrong one." Then silence for a few pages. Smears where ink had been blotted by tears or something wetter. The final entry made Ethan's skin crawl. The cries have returned. They come from the floor, from the walls, from the trees. My daughter is still out there. That other thing is not her. It never was. And I know what I must do. I will dig until I find her. They think me mad, but they do not hear the weeping. Ethan lowered the book into his lap and sat still for a long time. Clara hadn't spoken of her mother much. She died young, buried in a field upstate during a winter storm. The family never retrieved the body. Something about roads being impassable. Now he wondered if that had ever been the truth. He looked out the attic window toward the trees. Clara was already out there again, barely visible under the pale moon, bent over the hole. Digging. Always digging. And below her, if he let himself believe it just for a moment, thought he could hear it too. A thin, muffled cry. They found him just after dawn, near the edge of the hawthorn marsh, a boy, maybe 9 or 10, curled up in the reeds like a baby deer. His skin was pale and paper dry, cracked at the lips. His feet were bare and torn from thorns. He didn't speak when the farmer's sons carried him to town wrapped in an old quilt, just blinked slowly and stared straight ahead like he'd forgotten what eyes were for. The doctor was fetched, though he did little. Said the boy wasn't injured, just thin and startled. Sheriff Alden asked around. rode to the outlying farms, and hollered at the mills. No one claimed him. No one had seen him before. No one even knew of a child gone missing. The tailor's wife, squinting at the boy's collar, whispered that the stitching read, "I see." But the thread was so faint, it could have been anything. By the time word reached Clara Creeley, the boy had already been placed in the back room of the meeting hall, bundled beneath wool blankets, sipping broth he didn't seem to want. The townsfolk had gathered in clumps outside, muttering theories into the frost. Maybe a runaway, maybe one of those orphans from the city, maybe something worse. But none dared go near. Clara did. She walked into the meeting hall without knocking, didn't ask, didn't speak. She went straight to the boy and knelt beside him. Her hand reached for his, slow and trembling, as if she expected it to vanish at her touch. But he didn't flinch. He looked up at her, and for a brief moment something passed between them, not recognition exactly, but a kind of settling, a knowing. Then Clara smiled. It wasn't joy, not relief, not even madness, not entirely. It was the kind of smile that only comes after every possible explanation has been burned away, and all that's left is belief. She turned to the sheriff and spoke clear enough for everyone in the hall to hear. "This one's mine," she said. Ethan tried to protest when they brought the boy home, but Clara stood firm. She dressed him in Isaac's clothes, brushed the mud from his nails, combed his hair until it gleamed. She spoke to him as if they'd never been parted, fed him warm bread with honey, even hummed the lullabies she'd stopped singing months ago. The boy never spoke, not a word. But when he walked the floorboards, they didn't creak. When he stared at the fire, the flames would dim. And on the second night, as the snow began to fall again, Clara found muddy footprints leading from the back door to her bed, even though she had locked every window, and the boy had never left her sight. She didn't scream. She didn't wake Ethan. She simply whispered to the boy, "Welcome home," and kissed his forehead like he was flesh and blood. Even though she knew better. Ethan stood behind the house, eyes fixed on the fire. The journal hissed as it burned, pages curling inward like dying petals, words blackening into smoke. He didn't watch it for comfort, watched, because he needed to see it end. The pages had started to feel like a sickness in the house. Clara's handwriting, once soft and narrow, had grown fevered near the end scratches more than script. The same lines written over and over until the ink bled through the paper. He was never buried. He was never buried. He was never buried. When Ethan came back inside, Clara was at the cellar again. She knelt at the top step, hands folded neatly in her lap, rocking ever so slightly. She was humming, soft and low, the same tune she used to sing to Isaac before sleep came. But she wasn't singing to a boy now, she was singing to the cellar door. And sometimes when the wind died and the fire didn't crackle, you could swear something hummed back. She stopped eating. She said it made her sick, said food didn't taste right, said it wasn't meant for her anymore. Her eyes grew hollow first, then her cheeks. Still, she smiled at the boy in the bed, even when he didn't blink, even when his breath fogged the window, while the rest of the house stayed cold. The walls of the house began to change. Subtly at first, you think you saw them move in your periphery, a corner bulging ever so slightly. A hairline crack that wasn't there yesterday, now running floor to ceiling. Ethan ran his fingers along one such crack in the parlor and pulled back with a handful of dust that smelled like rot. He tried to fix it, of course, nailed the cellar door shut, tried to board over the bedroom window when he saw the frost gather in the shape of small, dirty handprints, but nothing held. Nails would bend, Boards would splinter. Once, he hammered a plank across the kitchen door and returned the next morning to find the nails neatly stacked on the table and the plank gone. He stopped going into the cellar. After the third night of hearing dragging sound slow and wet, like something heavy being pulled across stone, he stopped going near it at all. Clara no longer spoke to him. When she moved, it was with purpose, as if she had someone else to tend to, someone more important than a husband with a hammer and trembling hands. One night, Ethan tried to leave, just walked out into the frostbitten dark with no coat and no direction. He didn't get far, because something in the walls groaned, not like wood, like lungs. And from the cellar, a voice called Upnut, a child's voice, not Isaac's, but Clara's, calling his name, quietly, over and over, like a lullaby turned inside out. The fire had long since gone out. The hearth sat cold, dark as the corners of the house that no lamp could reach. Ethan woke not to sound, but to stillness a kind so deep it rang in the ears. He reached across the bed instinctively, half asleep, half hoping, but his hand touched only linen, cold linen. Clara was gone. The candle by the bedside had burned down to a stub, nothing but wax and wick, but the moonlight leaked through the window just enough to show him the rest. The blanket was pulled back, neat and careful, the way Clara folded it each morning, but there was something else, something scattered across the sheet like a trail of rot. Dirt, damp and clumped, packed heavy in places like it had been raked from below, not dust from the yard, not ash from the hearth, but grave dirt. Earth that had known the underside of nails, that stank faintly of roots and rain and something deeper. There were footprints, too. Small ones, bare, still wet. They started at the foot of the bed and walked across the floorboards, stopping just at Clara's side of the mattress, not leading to a window, not to a door, just there. Ethan's breath caught in his throat when he leaned in. On her pillow was a single handprint, no smudge, no drag, just a perfect print muddy, small, and oddly delicate pressed into the linen as if the child had leaned in close. As if he'd laid beside her one last time, fingers splayed gently, thumb curled in, still damp. He called her name once. Then again. Nothing. He checked the doors, the windows, the cellar. The nails he had hammered into the frame 2 nights earlier were gone, not pulled gone. The boards leaned against the wall, untouched, clean of soil or scratch. Only the hinges remained. The door itself hung slightly ajar. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The air rising from below smelled like the same dirt on the sheet sweat, root-choked and ancient. There were no cries that night, no scratching, no voice calling from the walls. Only silence. In the morning, the sun rose over Weir Hollow with its usual quiet mercy. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. Snow dusted the rooflines. But one house stood still. No fire, no smoke, no sign. Just a man on the porch, staring at the door that wouldn't stay closed. And inside, the bed lay empty, save for a hollow where a body should be, filled now with soil, and the mark of a child left behind like a signature carved in mud. They never tore the house down. Most say it should have rotted by now, collapsed beneath snow and time like all the others on that side of Weir Hollow, but somehow it hasn't. The shutters hang crooked, the windows webbed with frost and filth, but the bones of the place remain, dry, still, watching. No one lives there. Not since the winter Clara vanished. The last of the Creeley kin packed up and left the following spring, claiming they were done chasing ghosts. They boarded the front door with crooked nails and words no one remembers. A few boys tried to break in one summer. None of them made it past the threshold. One came back pale and shaking, said the floor moved. Now, the house just stands. People pass it without meaning to, heads down, breath held. You don't look too long at the second-floor window. You don't step on the porch. And if you walk the woods behind the house, you don't stop when you see the crooked tree with the blackened trunk. That's where the first grave was, or maybe the second. But it's not the graves people talk about, not really. It's the sound. They say it comes once or twice a year, always in the cold months, always after the ground freezes, but before the first heavy snow. Just past midnight, if you're close enough, if you're foolish enough to stand still and listen, you'll hear it. Not a scream, not even a sob. A whimper, shallow, wet, like lungs that forgot how to breathe, like someone trying to cry through a mouthful of dirt. It doesn't echo, it doesn't travel. The sound seems to come from beneath your boots, from under the earth itself. They say it's him, or what's left of him. The boy. Others think it's Clara. But most folks in Weir Hollow won't say either name anymore. They just call it the crying ground. And even the ones who claim they don't believe, who scoff at old ghost stories, they still cross the road when they reach that stretch of trees. No one plants there, no one digs. One man tried to clear the land once, years back. Bought the parcel cheap, spent a summer flattening brush and laying fence. In September, he left in the middle of the night, didn't take the tools. Didn't leave a note. Just gone. And ever since, the grass has grown wild again. The porch has sunk another inch, and the wind, when it moves through that broken frame of a house, sometimes carries a sound with it. A small sound, close to the ground, like someone down there hasn't finished crying.